full-off map in the reflection glossiness slot of the material, and I'm using the GGX BRDF to help with the realism. Now, assuming all I want to do is render this orange plastic Stanford dragon, from here we need to factor in how we're going to light things. Now, this can vary hugely depending on the type of project you have, but you can see just from where I was before, I've just simply switched things up, and if I go from the perspective viewport, you can see all I have is kind of a standard Studio Cyc that's just a kind of grey material. I'm actually going to make this a little bit more white. And the only thing lighting this scene at the moment is an HDR. And I'm actually using an HDR that was shot at Electric Art, a company I used to freelance for. And at this stage, usually 90% of the time when I start a project, I rely on an HDR to set the basic tone of the image. Now, depending on the HDR you use, you're going to completely change the look and feel of an object. For a studio lit character or object like this, it's usually good to stick with more bright values. But if I just run through and find some different HDRs to use here, you can see you can completely change the way things look. And in most cases, depending on the HDR you use, you'll have a specific angle on that HDR which brings out the most detail and the most shape on the object. So pay close attention to, like I was saying earlier, the silhouette of the character, how the border outlines are detailed, and then how the actual detail on the inside of the object is being defined. Now, the great thing about CGI and lighting is that no matter how low detailed some areas look, you've always got the option to go in and further enhance things. And that's where you'll see photographers that art they have is taking reality and giving it that final extra boost of detail through the use of extra lighting like softboxes and spotlights that just bring life to the image they're trying to create. Like I was saying, if I go back to the HDR and just rotate it, I'm using V-Ray Real Time here because it gives me very quick feedback. I've got it set to CPU because when you have V-Ray RT set up to use the GPU, it still doesn't have a lot of features like the fall-off map in the glossiness slot working. So it's a little bit slower to utilize the CPU, but it's still fast enough to get this kind of real-time workflow happening when you rotate the HDR. So I'm just going to move it, a few degrees at a time, and you can see here we're not in an ideal position because all the detail on the scales is lost and that natural strong lighting from the HDR isn't visible, most likely because it's been caught behind the cyc. And as we go further and further, you can see we actually changed the look and feel of things here. It looks a bit more nighttime now. And we create a nice silhouette. So I mean, even if that's your goal to create something that looks a bit darker like this, I could go in on the cyc and just make things a bit darker here. And then, like I was saying earlier, I can turn on these extra lights I've got to enhance the shape, like so, bringing out the silhouette of the character and adding some depth. But ultimately, that's just one way of looking at things, and this is why throughout the course I'm going to need to go in and break each lesson into different types of projects. So some lessons you're rendering realistic things in a sunny outdoor environment. In other situations, you're rendering things at nighttime. In other situations, you'll be rendering cartoony looking things. And then there'll be situations where you need to combine all of those different types of looks, for example, on car renders. So I'm just going through and changing the HDR. And depending on the HDR you use, you'll also need to adjust the multiplier. So when I change the HDR, I'm going to go back and turn off the extra lights I have in the scene, because I don't want to distract myself. I just want to see how the raw HDR looks and use that as a base to determine how much extra work I need to put in to bringing out detail on the character, or any type of asset you're utilizing, or the scene in general. So on this HDR, I'm going to go up on the intensity. And you can see the natural lighting in the HDR starts to bring out some shape on the object. Now I can actually go into Photoshop and make further adjustments to this HDR, but I'll save that for another lesson, because as you know from lesson 6, I believe, in the Mastering V-Ray course, adjusting the HDR is an extremely powerful option when it comes to determining how realistic your objects look or how realistic your scenes look. So I've just changed the HDR once again to one from HDR Sets, which I also used in the Mastering V-Ray finale. And throughout my career, I can't honestly say I've ended up using a huge array of different HDRs as a base for scenes. And of course, you don't have to use an HDR. You can rely solely on V-Ray lights. So if I turn off the HDR here, and actually just make this background a bit wider, of course you can begin to light things purely with just lights, and I will show that in different scenes as well, and how you utilize more detailed shaders to bring out the realism. Because I personally find that when you're utilizing V-Ray lights to render things in your scene, it can be difficult to get things looking perfectly photoreal unless you go in and add those extra little touches to the shading side of things. But if I go out and just duplicate this light and bring it over the top to provide more fill, I'm going to make the light bigger. You can see how I can manually kind of get the same look and feel through to the use of artificial lighting. But whenever you use artificial lights like this, it won't always have that detailed touch that you'd get out of an HDR. So that's why I like to use a combination of the two methods of lighting. But it's important to realize also that if you start adding too many lights into the scene, things can become overlit and you start losing shape. So if I quickly render the scene where it's at, what you'll notice is that because I've added this top light now, we've got the HDR lighting the scene and the side lights, that things are going to probably be a bit too bright in areas. And you need to start to factor in how to balance that out. So I'll let this render and show you where it's at. So now that it's overlit, there's a couple of things happening. Firstly, we're losing the asset against the background, and therefore the silhouette has been degraded, and also the color of the image and the shape of the image has been lost due to overlighting. And you can even see that the yellow is kind of crunching here. So that's where I need to cancel the render and go in and readjust the intensity of the lighting. So I'm going to drop the multiplier down to 0.4 on the HDR used, and I'm going to go to this above light, and I'm going to change this from 11 to 6, and then re-render. And now that we have dropped those values down, there's still areas where the highlights are pinging off white, but the overall shape isn't blooming out so much. And we still have the character against the background again. Things are still just a little bit too overblown, as you can see on the floor here. So the thing causing that overblown highlight is obviously the top light. So once again, I'm just going to quickly go into that light, make the adjustment down to 3, and I'm going to re-render. The lighting in the scene now is a little bit more balanced, but one thing I don't have, and this is where I also explained in the Mastering V-Ray finale, is that little bit of extra bonus lighting that you'd get out of HDR Light Studio. And because this is the first lesson, I'm not going to break down exactly how HDR Light Studio works. We're going to go into that in later lessons. But you'll notice here that we've got the option of kind of manually placing some specific lights to catch some extra highlights on the character and hopefully bring out just a little bit more of the edges and detail that we have available. So I'm going to go in, I've loaded that HDR Light Studio light into a composite map and I've set it to addition. So that's just going to pop up over the top of the HDR like you can see here. And then I'll do a re-render. And what it's going to do is it's going to add this lighting over the scene lighting. So now we've got a combination of an HDR light, scene lights from V-Ray, and HDR Light Studio lights. Not every project is going to require all three in combination. Some might require just HDR Light Studio, others might require just V-Ray lights and an HDR, and then there might be others where it's just an HDR and the HDR Light Studio. It really depends on the project, and hopefully throughout the course there's a couple of different examples of how I can show you those combinations. But for this first lesson, I thought it would be good to just kind of add in the different types of lighting available that we're going to be looking at in later lessons. Now you can see with the addition of this extra light, some more edges are being caught with highlights, and it's just bringing out a bit more shape in the object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save off this render and bring it into Photoshop and make a couple of quick adjustments to it before making one last final evaluation, which will be to go in and add some bonus passes, which are designed for the retoucher to have a little bit more control over where the highlights sit on the image. But it's also important to realize that it can become, once again, overly lit, and you have to be careful when you're working with those types of bonus passes because it can also ruin the realism in the render. So I'll load this up in Photoshop. So with the main image rendered out here, you can see what's happening is the background looks a little bit messy. Often throughout my career, when I've given renders like this to retouchers, what they do is they'll create an alpha, or I'll give them an alpha of the character or the asset. They'll separate it off the background and then just paint in a solid color where they want it to while keeping the shadows there. Now, like I was saying, there's one last thing to factor in, and that's the bonus passes. So if I go into HDR Light Studio and just turn off these first lights, you can see I've got a couple of main specular highlights that I've created here, and I'm going to render those out separately from V-Ray just like they are here so that you can see how you can use them to bring out shape on the object. And I might actually just change the location of this light. Okay, so for this particular pass, what I'm going to do in V-Ray is I'm going to go into V-Ray, make a V-Ray material. I'm going to make it black and fully reflective, and I'm going to turn off Fresnel reflections. The reason I do that is because in HDR Light Studio, the material we're seeing here doesn't have Fresnel enabled. So to simulate exactly what we're seeing, we need to turn that off and make it just a purely reflective object. Now I'm going to assign that to the dragon, and I'm going to hide the background, and I'm going to disable all the lights in the scene except the HDR bonus layer. So in the HDR here, I'm going to turn off this base layer and just load in bonus 1. And you can see I've got the inverse gamma in the V-Ray HDR I loaded to 0.45. to correctly simulate once again how things are appearing, and I'm just going to render this off. As you can see, things are a bit too intense, so I'm going to go into the multiplier of that light and set it to 0.3 and re-render. Now you can see we're getting that same lighting popping up through, and I'm going to save this out and then load it up in Photoshop. So I've got the two layers in Photoshop here, and I can turn this to linear dodge and bring it over the top, and because it's a 32-bit file, which is basically an HDR, I can drop the intensity of that layer, and you can see where we're lacking detail, we can start to add it in again. Now, of course, I can also go in and manually paint where I want this to show up. I can get rid of it in places, or I can add it. And I know this isn't the best example for showing you how to get things looking really nice, but it's just the starting lesson, and I just wanted to break down the workflow that I use on projects. So in the next project, I'm going to be utilizing a similar setup to this, but we're going to get a photoreal product render happening using a combination of these three different types of lighting. So you can see little bits of highlights that pop up here. What I can do is I can fill that layer with black, and then just manually paint in small areas where I think it can look good. So it's just the first lesson, and I just wanted to quickly break down the different elements that make up an image and the different aspects that I'm going to focus on each image when building different scenes. The next lesson, I'm going to go in and explain how to make a photorealistic product shot utilizing the knowledge I've taught in this lesson. So we're going to first choose an HDR that looks good, and the majority of the lesson is going to obviously be focused on making the lighting and the product look good. From there, I'm going to go in and show you how to utilize HDR Light Studio to refine the lighting. And then lastly, there'll just be a little bit of Photoshop work to get things having that last little bit of pop. It's going to be a simple scene, and we're going to work our way up to more complex projects like cars and characters. Thanks heaps, guys. I know you waited a long time for me to get started on the course, and just like the V-Ray course, no matter how long it takes, I'm going to make sure that when the course is done, I've kind of covered everything to do with lighting, and if there's anything left over in terms of the more specific aspects of lighting, I'll go in and potentially make a few separate lessons for those. What I mean by that is I'm definitely going to cover how to do cars in this course, but there's so many different subtopics to cars. You know, you've got outdoor cars, you've got indoor cars, you've got cars that require HDR Light Studio. So here you can see an example of a car that's half been lit with an HDR and the other half lit with HDR Light Studio. You've also got a car that's only been lit with an HDR. I've just spent a lot of time manually adjusting things to, to be balanced quite nicely. So there was no extra HDR Light Studio work done on this shot, and this is pretty much just a raw render straight out of V-Ray. Then on top of that, you've got cars that are only lit with HDR Light Studio. For example, this BMW here. So like I was saying, throughout the course, I'm going to do my best to break down the different types of lighting available. And once again, you can see in this Cocoa Pops job, this was lit the exact same way I've just lit this first lesson, just utilizing a combination of some V-Ray lights, HDR Light Studio, and an HDR just to give it an overall look feel. Thanks guys, I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and I'll see you in the next one.